Everybody, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming to this event entitled "Strengthening Deterrence in the Third Nuclear Age," which is part of the series that Policy Exchange are doing under their National Nuclear Enterprise Commission work. A series of events looking across the breadth and depth of the whole national nuclear enterprise, both civil and military, and then all the penumbra around that, regulatory, academic, industrial, etc., etc. We hope to have the whole wrapped up with an overall report out somewhere in the summer, but to date we're keeping as hazy as the publication of the Defence Investment Plan. Nuclear weapons, and tonight's event is very much on the nuclear weapons side. Nuclear weapons are, of course, very much at the forefront of all our thinking at the moment, with conflicts in Ukraine and now Iran, which are either about or certainly shaped by the ownership of nuclear weapons. And the event tonight takes as its foundation two of our publications under that commission, one of which was authored by one of our panellists tonight. And that's the Deterrence theory of Sir Michael Quinlan, one of our great thinkers and writers on the whole business of nuclear theory, deterrence theory, and very much what the national posture should be. And that paper looks at, and we're all very familiar with talking about the use of the military in a legal context, are we not at the moment for various reasons, but I think it's fair to say this paper goes back to very much the moral basis of what our national approach should be to thinking through the fundamental questions of why we have nuclear weapons, do we have to have them, and if we do, how should we go about thinking about our posture and approach to make them effective as a deterrent. And Sir Michael Quinlan always pointed out that ultimately these things are not just military weapons with a very big bang, they are always there to serve a political purpose. The second paper was written by a few of us here at Policy Exchange and Lord Stirrup's researcher Daniel Skeffington, which was called Intellectual Rearmament in the Third Nuclear Age. And I'll just say a little bit about that, as it's in the title of the event tonight. And the paper postulates that we're in the third age because the first one was Cold War I, where we all thought we knew about deterrence. And if you're my age, then you will have started your military career in the original Cold War. We then have the post-1989, if you like, happy period, the unipolar moment, the hyperpuissance of the United States, as the French would have called it, maybe 20 years there, where we postulate that maybe we let our thinking ossify a little bit, and the machinery of thinking about nuclear and the nuclear deterrent national machinery tended to rust up a bit. And then, I would argue, the last 20 years, from I would say 2007 onwards, which is when Putin made his speech at the Munich Security Conference, then we are back in an era of great power competition, but now not with the bipolarity of two superpowers, but with the rise of China, several major superpowers who are nuclear armed, and many other growing powers who are also nuclear armed. And having started off by saying, look at the conflicts in the world at the moment, especially what's going on in Iran. Of course, Iran is the only one of the crinks, doesn't yet have nuclear weapons. That's what the conflict, by and large, ostensibly is about. Now, to discuss this, we couldn't have two better equipped and more experienced panellists than we have tonight. The first I wish to introduce is Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the Lord Stirrup, who has had a stellar career, but I think quite interestingly for someone who started off in the Cold War and rose to the rank, as I'll come on to in a minute, the jobs he did at the end, also had a very gritty start to his career, flying on exchange with the Sultan of Omand's Air Force in 1775 in the Jebel Dhofar campaign. And then, once we came out of the happy period post-1989 with 9/11, was the commander of the British contingent in the response to 9/11 op veritas, before coming back as Chief of the Air Staff, and then Chief of the Defence Staff, a very difficult period indeed, the best part of 5 years, 2006 through 2010, the grittiest periods in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, as Chief of Defence Staff, through all that time, responsible to the Prime Minister for op relentless and continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. And our second panellist is Sir David Omand, who was Director of GCHQ, went on from there to be the Permanent Under-Secretary at the Home Office, where he was responsible, one of the leading lights in writing the contest, the counter-terrorism strategy. But before that, and the linking feature perhaps here, the linking personality, is Michael Quinlan, and David was one of Michael's pupils. In fact, Mary described David when he gave the Quinlan speech in 2020 as one of Michael's boys. So the way we're going to go through this evening is I'm going to ask our two panellists to make some introductory remarks. First off, Lord Stirrup is going to talk based on his paper or anywhere he wishes to take the issues that are raised by that paper. As I remind you, the deterrence theory of Sir Michael Quinlan, and then I'm going to ask David to respond and maybe add some shade on any of the issues he thinks we ought to be discussing tonight. I'll then chair a short Q&A to bring some of the major ideas out, and then we will open for Q&A from the floor. So, Lord Stirrup, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. My career was as you've heard, traditional game of two halves. First half was the Cold War, and then the second half was subsumed by Balkans and Iraq and Afghanistan. And during the Cold War, during the first half of it, deterrence was a major topic, a major intellectual concern. Whatever you thought about it, however you thought it might best be delivered, deterrence was at the centre of everything that we sought to do. But that was not true after the Cold War, and the Cold War ended a long time ago. Indeed, you've now got to be in your late 40s or older to have any real memory of it at all. And it's been my experience over the last couple of decades that people not only misunderstand deterrence, frankly, many of them just don't think about it at all. Or if they do, they just use it as a word, not understanding what it means. So last year, when Daniel Skeffington was helping me as a research assistant, I had a few discussions with him about this, and we decided that it was time that we brought a focus back on the subject. The big question was, where is today's Michael Quinlan? Of course, Michael Quinlan was in many ways irreplaceable, but we need the kind of intellectual power and intellectual debate that he brought to this whole subject. And that was the purpose behind the paper which you've had described and which some of you may possibly have read. The purpose of the paper was not to say, this is what deterrence is, this is how it's delivered, this is what it's all about. The purpose of the paper is actually reflected in this gathering this evening. It was about getting the conversation going again, stimulating the intellectual debate surrounding deterrence and getting it at the forefront of our minds in this very, very dangerous age. Some of the key principles which emerged from looking at Michael Quinlan's work and thinking about deterrence in the round were, first of all, that we have lived since 1945 in an age of nuclear weapons. We may think of this as the third nuclear age, not my term, I hasten to add, but it's been a continuous age of nuclear weapons. They're here and they're not going to be uninvented. And so we have to figure out how we're going to live with them. That was the key concern in the immediate post-Second World War era, and it remains a key concern today. But we have to ask ourselves whether the international situation has changed to such an extent that our approach to nuclear weapons and to deterrence ought to be rather different than it was in the Cold War. Or are all the old lessons, if we just relearn them, applicable to the modern context? As Ed has said, Michael Quinlan considered that thinking about nuclear weapons was not just proper and right, but it was necessary and indeed moral. Thinking about them was a moral activity. And I think that's very important because we have, to some extent, fooled ourselves that we live in a world that is governed and constrained by law and rules. That, frankly, has never been totally true. Powerful actors in the world have always, from time to time, done what they think is in their interests, irrespective of what others thought the rules or the law might be. But it's broadly the case that since 1945, for about 60 years or so, even major powers in the world were to some degree constrained by an international rules-based order. But that rules-based order existed, frankly, because it was underpinned by Pax Americana. The League of Nations failed because America was not a part of it. The United Nations, to the extent it has succeeded because it was underpinned by the United States. That no longer seems to be the case. So we have to ask ourselves how much we can rely upon rules and upon law, and how much we have to rely upon the moral case for doing what we think is necessary in a world which is governed perhaps by the rule of law, but where the law is the law of the jungle. I mean, let's face it, when faced with a knife-wielding homicidal maniac, it's not much good saying to them, you can't do that, it's illegal. So we have to think about it in moral terms as well as legal terms. We're also clear in our paper, as Michael Quinlan argued, that deterrence is not about one thing. It's about a spectrum of capabilities, and that not all, even military, all sorts of different areas can feed into deterrence. So we have to think about the spectrum that's necessary for exercising effective deterrence. But it is about two things in particular, and that is capability and credibility. And so we have to ask ourselves in terms of deterrence whether we think we're in the right space in terms of overall capability, and whether we think that capability is credible in the minds of an aggressor. And I would ask you just to think about the events of recent days. Whatever view you might take of the Israeli and American attack on Iran, you have to ask yourself whether our response in the days following that makes us look stronger or weaker in the mind of a potential aggressor, whether it makes us look stronger or weaker in the minds of potential friends and allies. These things are important. Credibility is crucial to deterrence. But deterrence, of course, takes place in the mind of an adversary, not in our own mind. So you can have the capability and you can have the credibility, but if they're not perceived as such by your adversary, then they will not be effective in terms of deterrence. So it's a form of cognitive warfare, always has been, long before that particular phrase became popular in defense circles. And the final point is that as we provide for our collective defense through NATO, clearly the UK does not have to have all the capabilities itself. But NATO, as an alliance, needs to have the capabilities, and those capabilities need to be resilient. And so one of the things I think we have to think about, particularly in the context of the modern world, is how we provide resilience within NATO and do not become over-reliant upon one source or one actor within the alliance. Because if we are over-reliant, then we could be building our deterrence upon sand. So those were the basic points that were put forward in the paper. I don't intend to speak any more this evening. I look forward to the conversation, but most importantly, I urge everyone in this room to get the conversation going, not just in here, but outside, and to get the thinking on this topic going throughout the country more widely. I don't expect every member of the public to be talking about deterrence the day after tomorrow, but I do expect the more thinking people within this country to be taking it forward as a very, very serious topic for the coming months and years. Because if we don't get this right, then in my view, major conflict in Europe becomes a near certainty within the lifetime of at least the younger members of the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, I said it was going to be topical. Moral basis underpinned by credibility in a world where the rule-based order is being replaced by the law of the jungle deterrence something you have to think about, very much a cognitive activity, which is what Michael Quinlan, I believe, always used to write about. David, over to you.
Thank you, and good evening. It's a privilege, I may say, Jock, to follow you on this subject. Ed was kind enough to mention in his introduction, I gave the Quinlan lecture in 2020 on the future of deterrence, and I reread it. Would I want to change the conclusions I reached in 2020? I came to the conclusion, no, I wouldn't, but I think we need to rediscover those conclusions, which feeds back to what Jock was saying about the conversation. I was tutored by Michael, as well as a number of others in this room, on these subjects. I did two of the jobs which he did, Defence Councillor in NATO, Deputy Under-Secretary of State for Policy, and indeed had to myself take some of these difficult decisions about future capabilities. Whilst I've got the floor, though, I would, and we've got Michael Quinlan in our minds, it's worth remembering that he wasn't just talking, it wasn't just nuclear. John Major brought him back to review the expenditure and activities of the secret agencies. The Treasury thought this was a wonderful way to produce a peace dividend. Michael looked at it with his characteristic rigor and quite rather than reduce, he cogently argued that in a world that's becoming more uncertain, which it was, you needed better intelligence and more intelligence, not less. Now, the paper is great, and I recommend that those who haven't read it should read it. It's Michael's starting point for deterrence was very simple. Inducing someone to refrain from unwanted action by putting before him the prospect that taking it will prompt a response with disadvantages outweighing the advantages of the action. One thing follows very clearly from that line of Quinlan thinking, which is it's not just about nuclear weapons deterring nuclear weapons. He wrote, and I'm quoting, political, economic, social, judicial, and even religious or cultural influences can sometimes make a contribution. So I describe this as a scale of D, from D minor, detection, exposure, disapproval, discouragement, deflection, dissuasion, and then finally you get to D major, which is the structures of nuclear deterrence. Michael was very careful about how he used terms like doctrine and theory, and I raised my eyebrows when I read a little bit of the paper. He tended to talk about nuclear weapons policy, because for Michael it all depended on the context. And there was a particular reason for that, which is that if, as we read in the paper, quotes, the possession and in extremis the use of nuclear weapons is both necessary and moral, then what do we say to the North Koreans and the Iranians and all the other countries that might want a nuclear weapon? They would be more secure, wouldn't they, if they had nuclear weapons? Michael's answer was not entirely to sidestep it, but to say it's all context specific. So what we should talk about is, for us, NATO, our contribution to NATO, the threat that Russia currently poses and for the foreseeable future will pose to NATO. And that was his way of acknowledging the kind of necessity argument. On morality, well, it's already been said. I don't know whether Michael knew of the historical judgment of Hannah Arendt. Those who choose lesser evil very quickly forget that it was evil that they chose. And for Michael, this was the key point. And as Jock has already indicated, if you're going to have nuclear deterrence, if you're going to have nuclear weapons, Michael's view is you've got to think it all the way through to use. You've got to think about how exactly the operational plans, the whole thing has to hang together. And that's very disturbing for somebody of Michael's moral standing, and indeed any of us. There's a debate we need to have about signalling to potential adversaries, and in this context we're talking about Russia. Should we be sending rather different signals or amplified signals? It's not an easy thing, I think, to come to it. There's one big red line which we've all set, which is in the Washington Treaty, an armed attack on NATO territory. And that's as clear as it sort of can be, although at the edges, when does sabotage of Polish rail lines become an armed attack? So there are some things to argue through, but basically that red line is reasonably straightforward. And the intent must be to convince the leadership in Moscow that we mean it, and NATO means it. The problem I've always had with additional red lines, and there's a sort of hint in the paper that perhaps we should be thinking about this, is that the adversary will creep right up to the edge of the line, because you've said, cross this line and there will be repercussions. And if the adversary's crept right up to the line, makes a bit of a misjudgment, a bit of a mistake, you've got to deliver the consequences. And that could be really quite difficult. So I'm slightly more of the Quinlan view that you have to leave some uncertainty in the mind of the potential adversary as to quite what is it that would get them engaged in what I call the engrenage of NATO response. But the adversary must know there will be an engrenage, that stepping over the armed attack line means that there will be, a response. Now we should discuss what current circumstances in Washington might or might not mean. I think all I could offer on that is to say, don't underestimate the power of the NATO military structure. There is a Supreme Allied Commander, happens to be an American, Supreme Allied Commander. He's got various pre-delegated powers to enable him to act effectively and swiftly in the event of military conflict. He would act in that way. I'm completely confident of that. Now, there may well be politicians on the other side of the Atlantic getting slightly alarmed at this point, but nonetheless we shouldn't doubt that that engrenage would have started. And that's what is really the deterrent. The thought you can't predict how all that's going to play out. You can't say, I've gamed my way through the various potential responses, and this could all end very badly. Final point, Michael was convinced that the purpose of NATO's having nuclear weapons was to deter war between nuclear armed powers, not to intimidate other powers, but to deter war between nuclear armed powers, with the kind of mantra that nuclear weapons and no war, or no nuclear weapons and war. He chose the former. And that I think was the right choice. It's the choice we still make. I'd better stop there because we want to leave as much time as possible and the other things to talk about, such as the position of the French and so on, which will all, I'm sure, come up in debate. Yeah, let me stop.
David, thank you very much.
Make just a point to it in response. I mean, I agree absolutely with everything that David said. In the paper, there was no intent to be specific about red lines, and nor do I think it did. And if it gave that sort of a hint of that, then that's a mistake. I think the paper is quite clear that there needs to be a considerable degree of ambiguity in the minds of an adversary about exactly what your response would be and when it would come. but there needs to be no ambiguity whatsoever that there will be something very nasty coming their way if they cross, and I think this was the phrase that gave you a pause, cross certain lines, but without being clear about what those lines are. Just that in extremis, when you get to the final line, as it were, of national survival, the nuclear weapons will be headed your way. I mean, there must be no doubt about that. And the second point, I didn't make it clear in my remarks, I talked about capability and credibility, but absolutely the additional point is that for Quinlan, deterrence was not a set of sealed boxes. It is this spectrum of capabilities, which includes, of course, non-military as well. But it is about, and I'm not sure that Mike Quinlan ever said this, but I certainly believe it's wrong to think about nuclear deterrence. You are trying to deter a situation in which you have a nuclear exchange. But to do that, you have to think about deterrence in the round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And David, thank you. No British military debate is complete without getting the French in there somewhere by the end. So I had a series of questions. I'm going to throw another one that comes to me just listening to the pair of you there, and also given some of what's been in the papers recently about the state of our diplomatic machine, whether indeed some of the stuff was slightly scurrilous, but nevertheless it paints a picture. You've both spoken about this is a cognitive warfare activity. I'm not afraid to use the term cognitive warfare, that deterrence happens in the minds of your opposition. It's not just about parity in nuclear weapons. Could I ask, where do you think we stand in our understanding of how our enemies think? If our deterrence is going to be credible, that's only going to be revealed when we find our opposition believed us, and presumably we need to know how they think and their decision-making processes in both the diplomatic sphere but also the military sphere. You mentioned, Jock, that maybe we got out of the habit of thinking about deterrence when in the first part of your career it was the forefront of all our minds. Do you think we need to reboot our thinking on that? What is the Whitehall machine like for understanding how our enemies might be understanding us and therefore being deterred? I don't know who wishes to go first.
Well, it's a crucial point, because if you want to convince your adversary of something, then you have to have a reasonably good idea of how they see the world. Not how you see it, but how they see it. And during the Cold War, we had a lot of Kremlinologists. There were people who thought about this deeply and who had a pretty good idea, as well as one can have, of somebody else's mind without getting inside it. It was, for them, I think, slightly easier because they were dealing with an autocracy. They were dealing with an institution, the Soviet Union, and it was not, after the days of Stalin, I would argue, an autocracy. It was an oligarchy, and therefore you could do a bit of sort of triangulation, and which gave you some assistance in knowing how they thought. The problem at the moment, and I think it's the problem in both Russia and China, I'll come on to China in just a second, is that they're now essentially autocracies. Getting inside the minds of one person is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, who here can tell me what Donald Trump's going to do next? So that is it. But you've got to have your best shot at it, and we're not good at it. We're recovering some of our capability in terms of Russia because of what's been happening in Ukraine. But frankly, I think we're nowhere in terms of China.
Thank you very much, David.
Just add a thought from the intelligence community perspective. The dangers of transferred judgment and mirror imaging, are seared into the souls of intelligence analysts. It is very difficult to see into the mind of somebody who was brought up in a very different way, who has a different belief structure, who interprets history in a very different way from you would if you studied at university or whatever. I think the starting point is you have to assume the adversary is rational when you're talking about potential destruction involving nuclear weapons. It's just that their rationality is going to look rather different from our rationality. And what really matters to them may be different from what would really matter to us. And we've seen this with Putin's history of Ukraine, for example, and the passion with which he supports the Russian church against the Ukrainian church and so on. He cares about these things. But when it comes to what we're talking about here, I believe that the Russian president and those around him do not want to end up in a situation where they are facing either defeat or annihilation. We don't either. So there is a certain symmetry there, and that makes us quite cautious. And I think in the end, it's that fear of, well, bright idea, Mr. President, but how are you going to, what's the off-ramp? Who knows? I don't know. But that, I think, is the way to look at it, and not to mirror image and say, we think this is our doctrine, that it must be their doctrine, because they will be thinking differently.
Yes, I wonder how many Mandarin speakers we have in the Foreign Office now, or how few we have in the MOD at the moment, or how many students we've had who've been through Chinese universities compared to vice versa. It's quite a staggering imbalance. And moving on, because you mentioned the Washington Treaty, and I was looking up at the Strategic Posture Committee of Congress, and you mentioned, can anybody know exactly where Donald Trump is going to be by tomorrow's Truth Social tweet? And I was just struck that even though the American Nuclear Posture Review only came out in the most recent in 22, the committee I mentioned from Congress started in 23, published its report recently. It talks about how much they're dependent on allies. One wonders about that relationship at the moment. You already suggested, David, there's a deep state there that would grind away in French.
It's less the deep state. It's more just the military structures are there, and they're staffed with professionals, and we are linked. The NATO nations are linked in. That hasn't been demolished. That hasn't been disbanded. There'll be fewer Americans. There'll be more European effort, quite right too. But the structure's still good. Now, if we began to see real change to that, then I would start to get really quite worried. But I don't detect that.
Do you not? How would you look at the commentary just from senior political leaders then? One looks at Merz, one looks at Macron. They still pose this as a condition if it happens, if the US nuclear umbrella isn't quite what it used to be. And I would link that back to the word you both used, credibility. If you're asking about the state of credibility, then you've started to answer the question. Where do you think
yes, but that
NATO
becomes
stands?
The self-fulfilling prophecy that you have to be rather careful about.
But
you have to do that kind of thinking in private.
But my point is that they aren't.
Not in public.
My point is, it is being made public by others at the moment.
And
Donald Tusk
good contingency planning should be based on the the reasonable proposition, not on hope or just hope. So you've got to do that kind of planning and thinking. We've been given a big shock by Washington, so we are, across Europe, we're actually beginning to take some of this more seriously than we did. George Robertson's review pointed very clearly to NATO being where we should focus, which I think is quite right. So at the end of it, we may come out with a more European-heavy NATO, with an underpinning structure that the US military still support with some key capabilities. But the argument that has not been properly made, and I don't know why our leaders didn't make it, is that if for the United States, the priority is China, and they envisage possibly getting into a conflict with China, Russia will probably support China in that event. Who is going to look after the Atlantic and the North Atlantic? The answer is it has to be NATO and the NATO allies. NATO doesn't exist as a European gift to protect Europe. It's there for the protection of the North Atlantic area, and that includes the United States. And in a conflict with China, they would need the support that NATO would provide.
And I would just add that you talked about, credibility and whether that's been undermined. Well, what's one of the consequences of the Trump presidency? Defence spending is shooting up across Europe. I was talking to some Polish representatives this morning. They are spending 5% of GDP on defence, and they said if it needs to be 8%, so be it. And the public's ready for that. I wish we were in the same position here. We're not, but I am, call me a wild-eyed optimist, but I do think we'll be in a better position before too long than we are now. We're too slow about it, but we are making some progress. So, in the sense of better European preparedness, Trump has been a positive factor in all of that. And some people have started saying the US is no longer a reliable ally. I don't think that's helpful. First of all, I don't think it's true, but secondly, I don't think it's helpful. What we should be saying is that the United States is an ally on which we should not over-rely, because it might be doing something else, its forces might be engaged somewhere else. And that goes back to the point I made earlier, that we need to be resilient within NATO. We don't want a sort of single source supplier within NATO, and if something goes wrong with that, we're screwed. That's crazy. So it's high time, we got off, that particular track and got onto a more sustainable one. So, while I'm not going to argue for Donald Trump in all of this, some of his effects have been positive in that regard.
So with the enhanced European structure, where would the pair of you see that go in the nuclear realm? We've had Macron speak only on the 2nd of this month, talking about what he's doing within the EU, but referencing the UK and the Northwood Agreement of last year at the start. And one could look at that and almost see here the UK as a bridge, having now very close relationship with the US and a burgeoning one with France. Maybe I could fold in, I was going to make it a separate question, but the whole question of our buying the F-35A, which gets us back into having a lower yield nuclear weapon, but it would be a US weapon. Is that consistent with looking after ourselves and maintaining all the pieces, the rungs we might want on our own escalatory ladder? So how do you see the European, and not just the EU, including the UK, how do you see the European nuclear posture evolving within the backdrop of Europe stepping up to be able to do more to bolster the alliance, not to separate from it?
Well, of course, one of Michael Quinlan's points was that the UK, being a nuclear power, gave a second centre of decision to NATO, which complicated the Soviet Union's calculations in all this, so made it much riskier for them. In terms of strategic responses, that remains the case. The UK strategic nuclear deterrent remains operationally independent. It's perfectly true that using an American weapon on an F-35A would not fall into that category, but it does spread that part of the spectrum, if you like, the sub-strategic part of the nuclear spectrum more widely across NATO. So in that sense, it complicates any Russian planning to counter that. But personally, in the long term, I think we do have to restore a degree of independence from the United States in that particular part of our capability. But that's a long-term issue. The short-term distribution of the sub-strategic nuclear burden, I think, is a good thing. It's not so much as it is for other NATO countries a question of nuclear burden sharing, because we already do that, but it does actually complicate Russian decision making.
Thank you very much. David, do you add anything to?
It took some persuasion for me to buy into the F-35 decision, because it's an American weapon. B-61 weapon that we will be carrying, and therefore it's the US president that has the say. So if you're thinking in national terms, that's not really adding very much. If you're already having those doubts about US commitment, it doesn't really affect that. I can see, however, the case that other European NATO nations will welcome the fact that the Brits are in there too, the Royal Air Force is in there. There have been some wobbles over the last 5 years as to whether European nations really want to get involved in carrying US weapons in a crisis. So from that point of view, it's probably a bit of a plus. But I would put out of our minds entirely any thought that this is, as it were, bolstering our national capability. But as I was saying earlier, that's not what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about how do we keep NATO together.
Yeah.
Could I just make an additional point on the Macron proposal? I mean, this is quite intriguing. I'm not sure how it's going to work. I mean, basically, he's talking about basing French nuclear-armed aircraft forward in other NATO countries. Now, having been responsible in my past for nuclear weapons, let me tell you, this is no small task. I mean, the security required for nuclear weapons, the procedures required and all the rest of it are, rightly incredibly restrictive. So you can't just sort of sling a nuclear weapon on a Rafale and send it off to a base in Germany somewhere. I mean, how's it going to be guarded? How's it going to be loaded down? All of these sorts of issues. This is a very, very complicated issue. So it was a good political ploy, but in terms of practicality, I remain to be convinced that it's actually credible.
And that's where, as it were, Michael Quinlan, listening in on this debate, would say that's really what's important.
Yeah.
It's not about political gestures, it's about the credibility that comes from you have actually thought it all through. But, full marks to France for having at least raised it. I was responsible for drafting the wording that our Prime Minister Major and the French President gave at their famous Chequers summit, which said essentially that a strategic threat to one is the strategic threat to the other. Given how narrow the channel is, this has struck me as a statement of blinding obvious. But for the French, this was really important. This was our recognizing that they were not in NATO's nuclear planning group. They should rejoin. That would be the best thing Macron could do, would be to say we're going to rejoin and talk all this stuff through in NATO, not in a separate EU room. But I don't think they seem ready to do that. But that would be what I would want to see.
And the final question for me before I open to the floor. And Michael Quinlan thought and wrote a lot about the broader diplomacy around nuclear weapons, therefore the need for non-proliferation treaties, the need for arms limitation treaties. As Macron said in that speech, the field of rules is now a field of ruins. Where would Quinlan be today on thinking through that backdrop of treaties and, if you like, international governance around the spread of nuclear weapons, given the sort of collapse of the treaties we've seen in the last couple of years? And what ought we to do about it?
I think he would be horrified to see the way in which, almost casually, the arms control treaties of the last 20 years have sort of fallen away one by one. He was a supporter of the dual track approach, getting the SS-20s on proliferation. He spent a lot of time trying to persuade other countries to adopt sensible approaches to desire to possess nuclear weapons. Even nuclear testing, which I thought had been finally, no pun intended, buried, now seems to be back on a sort of policy agenda. If we give the impression to Russia that we won't really mind if they start covert testing, then all of that will collapse. And I think that's not good. I think Michael would strongly disapprove.
I agree. I do think that the international response, or lack of adequate international response to Putin's seizure of Crimea and then invasion in 2022 was, a nail in the coffin of non-proliferation. Ukraine gave up its weapons and look what it got in return. That's hardly a convincing argument for others not to acquire them, let alone to give them up. And of course, in terms of international arms limitation treaties, the complicating factor now is China. And so, I mean, we're aware of the arguments. America says China's got to be included. China says, well, we've hardly got any. I mean, we're nowhere near the stage where we should be included. I think if that particular issue can be resolved, I don't know how, but if it can, then there may be a prospect of restarting some of the major arms limitation treaties. But that's what I think the area of focus needs to be. But I agree.
That, of course, was the argument we used.
Yeah, of course, exactly.
We're too small to be included.
Yes, I think Britain and France has about the same as China at the moment, collectively, doesn't it, together. That's the end of us steering the conversation here. Over to the floor, and I'm sure we have a microphone. Can I just ask that when you ask a question, the gentleman in the middle here was first with his hand up. If you ask a question, could you your name please and the organisation you're representing, if you are.
My name is Michael Stephen, and I used to be a Member of Parliament here in the UK. You rightly say that deterrence is based on the assumption that your adversary is rational. But how does that apply to a theocracy like Iran, where their leaders claim to take their instructions from God? Now, unless you can be confident that your adversary is rational, the only way to protect yourself, surely, is to make sure that he never gets his hands on a nuclear weapon.
Well, I think it comes back to David's point and the point that we make in the paper, which is that you have to look at rationality from the adversary's perspective and not your own. And I would argue that even theocracies don't want to see their regime destroyed. They don't want to see the hold over their people destroyed. So, I mean, if you can look at their structure of reality, if you like, then you can influence it. And certainly Michael Quinlan's argument was the only people you can't deter are the truly insane. You can deter people whose frame of reference is different from yours, provided you understand what it is.
And if you're a theocracy, then what it is you hold most valuable is indeed that. And that, of course, you do not want to see destroyed. I mean, you can have arguments, particularly in the case of Russia, about what would it take to deter them. And, the intelligence staffs over the years have examined that. But I think common sense tells you that if the sort of group that's in charge in Moscow does not want to lose what they have, and they would if they're foolish enough to get drawn into that. I think the same is probably true of North Korea, although some of their actions are pretty odd, but nonetheless, from their point of view, they are rational.
Indeed, thank you very much. Down here in the white T-shirt.
Thanks very much. Ben Tallis from Helsing. I'm normally based in Berlin and just visiting London, and I'm struck by the difference in the conversation here compared to there. It seems as though in Germany, a country that is spending an awful lot of money on rearming at pace and scale, now with facing a very serious deterrence situation with its permanently stationed brigade in Lithuania, not dissimilar to the UK, but very dissimilar in terms of the pace and scale and spending of rearmament. Yet here, I'm hearing that we should continue to rely on the US to a greater degree than I hear that in Berlin. And I think that's extremely worrying to hear. Speaking beyond the nuclear realm for a second, because I think there is, as you rightly mentioned, a continuum of deterrence that we should be talking about. What would be your priorities for actually boosting our conventional deterrence and then sub-nuclear deterrence from a UK point of view and a European point of view? And how do we send that signal very clearly to Vladimir Putin, who at the moment, I would disagree, thinks he will be punished or denied his aims? Thank you.
I mean, first of all, I agree entirely with the first part of your analysis, although I would say that the difference is increasingly confined to a small part of Downing Street. If you look at comment in this country from all sides, the cry is we need to spend more on defence and we need to do it quickly. So I think the one area where that's not true is in the younger generation in this country, and they remain to be sold on that. And there's an important message there for us. But the wider argument has been won, but we've not yet shifted the government. But as I said earlier, I'm optimistic that we will start to see some progress in that regard. In terms of what we can do, I'm very clear that the most pressing military requirement for this country, and indeed for NATO more widely, is not actually military. It's not about more ships or soldiers or aircraft, important though those things are. The most pressing requirement is to grow an agile, innovative and rapidly scalable defence industrial base across Europe. And by defence industrial base, I don't mean just the traditional defence firms. I mean the industrial hinterland more widely. We've seen in Ukraine, as we saw in previous wars, how important the traditional consumer-based part of society can be in defence terms. We don't, for example, need or want to be producing 20,000 drones a month, because if we did that now and we had a war in 3 years, they'd be out of date. But we need to be able to produce 20,000 drones a month quickly when we do need them. So that's the kind of agile capability that we need. If we don't have that, it doesn't matter how many soldiers or ships or aircraft we have, they won't have the wherewithal to fight. Also, if we don't grow the industrial base, but we boost spending on conventional military forces, what's going to happen? Demand will so far outstrip supply, will drive up defence sector inflation, and we just won't be able to spend the money effectively. So that's what I would see as the most important requirement as of now. All of it requires money.
Thank you. David.
Just a quick comment on the first part of the question. Germany is rearming. That's a brave thing to do. Clearly there is public support in Germany for it. I just wish we were slightly closer to that position. But there's a world of difference, is there not, between rearming and putting two fingers up across the Atlantic and saying, we don't trust you anymore, we're going to look after ourselves, and saying we are actually the people who are going to build the basis of a new NATO where the Europeans pull their weight. And as I've said, the strategic arguments for America are they actually need that. So I am reasonably confident that serious people and serious planners will accept that.
I'd just like to point out that both those points, especially what Lord Stirrup said about defence industrial base, is official policy, exchange policy on this one, and copies of the Say-Do Gap paper are still available to download via our website. The lady down here, second row.
Hi, Latika Burke from the Nightly Australia. Can I just add a quick comment to your one about NATO? I thought it was really interesting at The Hague last year and also at Munich this year. If you look at the Americans who are buying into NATO, the transatlantic relationship, it's not very encouraging. It's retiring Dems. AOC this year wasn't exactly forthright in a kind of full-throated defence of the alliance at all. So personally, I'm not as confident about you on that. But I wanted to ask, there's a reflex on this panel about more nuclear is bad. Is that your belief? And if not, we have seen some Indo-Pacific countries start talking about the unimaginable, which is getting nuclear weapons. We've seen Poland talk about this. What is your view on more states acquiring nuclear capability?
My view is that it would be extremely unfortunate, but it's probably inevitable. So I've always been a believer in figuring out how to live in the world as it is rather than as you wish it to be, which is why deterrence is one of the many reasons why deterrence is such an important issue for us today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And if you encourage proliferation, it will be taken up by countries that you're not so happy to see possess nuclear weapons. And it's just one more breakdown of the order that we would like to see. And the risk of mistakes, accidents, failure to look after, safeguard nuclear material, all of that. I mean, we've spent a long time and a lot of money being safe, responsible nuclear power. Not everybody who might proliferate necessarily is going to be like that, at least to start with.
Gentleman down here on the front left. Do catch my eye as I'm scanning the room.
Thank you. Greg Giles. I'm a PhD candidate in war studies at King's College London.
Very good.
Where I have been spending many weeks going through Sir Michael Quinlan's papers. I'd like to come back to that notion of producing the next Michael Quinlan. And of course, it doesn't have to be a man. The point I'd like to get your general sense on is the Whitehall machinery, is professional military education, are they capable of producing figures like Michael Quinlan again? What would it take? Thank you.
I'll leave you to answer on behalf of the civil service.
Yes.
Right?
I think it would be harder, it is harder, than it was in Michael Quinlan's day. The status of the civil service vis-a-vis the political world has changed. Now that's probably not going to change back very quickly, if ever. The reliance on of elected ministers on having people like Michael Quinlan who really knew this stuff. If we're in a deep enough crisis, no doubt that would be recreated, but it's not really been the case for the last 10 years or so, I suspect. So I think it's harder, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. I think we should. And it's not just the nuclear weapons agenda, it's the whole international affairs, war studies agenda, the diplomatic agenda of having diplomats who have lived all this stuff, who really know, for example, Moscow. And that probably takes rather more effort than we're currently putting in.
I mean, first of all, I don't think it needs to come from the civil service. Secondly, I think if we get enough people talking about and thinking about and discussing seriously these issues, then we will get more Michael Quinlans. That's the key to it, I think. Which is one of the reasons why we want to get this conversation, this debate going much more widely and on a sustained basis, not on a sort of one-off event basis, but get it into the mainstream, back into the mainstream. Then yes, I think there's no shortage of intellectual power out there. So I'm confident on that score. I rather agree about the civil service. I mean, there are so many other pressures at the moment. But as I say, you don't need to look for a single source on these things.
I just add, as my last job was Director General of the Defence Academy, and when I arrived in 2018, I found the Higher Command and Staff course, the last big course our baby generals will do, didn't mention nuclear weapons at all. In contrast, the French one, Shem, on their first day they go to the French nuclear proving ground, and they're instructed on how all power starts off at that, and the French sense of self is totally different, and what they inculcate in their military officers. That has changed. We've changed the David.
Just an anecdote to illustrate the point I was making. Michael Quinlan teamed up with Sir John Hunt, the then Cabinet Secretary, and they engaged in a private correspondence with the leadership of the Catholic Church to persuade the hierarchy not to support what was then rather fashionable ideas about no first use and the moral problems of possessing nuclear weapons. As far as I know, they didn't consult ministers, they didn't tell ministers, they had both devout Catholics, they had some direct channels, and they used them. I find it difficult to think today of anything comparable.
Is it interesting that we spoke about the American policy development, just 22 to 23, between the National Posture Review and Congress's Strategic Posture Committee, in that they turned around thinking on no first use and sole purpose for exactly that sort of thinking. So it is very much very au courant. The gentleman here, and then there's one at the back. I'm tracking at the moment.
John Philibban from CGI. To what extent does the nation require a debate on nuclear deterrence versus a debate on welfare spending?
Well, it's not. It's interesting because in the House of Lords debate today there's a question which sort of led round to a variety of views on the need for a national conversation, a national narrative. I mean, the need for a national conversation on defence was an issue which was raised in George Robertson's Defence Review, and it hasn't really been happening. And I suggested to someone that if the government really wanted to get a conversation going on this, one surefire way of doing it was for the Prime Minister to major on it at his speech at the Labour Party conference. Now, what do we think the odds are of that? Pretty low, aren't they? You talk about whether we need a debate on this or that. We need a debate on both, of course, because the question is what's the balance to be struck between them. And for that, we need political leadership and courage, which, as Jim Hacker always remarked, was something that you never want to get involved in if you're a politician. So I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic about that. I'm rather pessimistic about our political leaders, having that kind of public debate. It's the kind of public debate we need, which means others have got to raise the flag. And they are doing that, and I'm encouraged by that. I mean, it used to be that if you were arguing for greater defence spending, you were one of a very small minority. You're not now. You're one of a great number of people. And as I say, the big difference there is in. I'm afraid I'm too old. I've lost track of all the generations. Is it Gen Z now, or is it moved on to something else? I can't remember. But anyway, there needs to be a much greater focus there. And we need as a society to take that forward. And I'm afraid, I wish it were otherwise, I don't think we can rely upon our political leaders to do that. So it's up to the rest of us to get on with it. But the debate, when we have it, has got to be about the balance that you strike between these things. And of course it's extraordinarily difficult. I call for more defence spending, faster. I know how difficult it is. My son is a doctor in the NHS. I know how pressed they are. Although I have to say that as the father of a doctor in the NHS, my view, as it would be his, is that money isn't the answer to their problems. There are other answers that are still not forthcoming. Yes, we need to have that wider debate in society because, as I say, it's all very well to say spend more on defence. Where's it going to come from? I don't shy away from that. We spend under 5% of our total public expenditure on defence. We spend over 40% on health and social security, and it's heading northwards. And even without changing the balance, if we don't do something about it, we're going to go bankrupt. My own view is that we're on the road back to 1976 and the IMF. People say, oh, it's nothing like 76, the situation is very different. Of course it is. But the arithmetic's the same. You keep borrowing, and borrowing and borrowing, and eventually the interest rates are going to be reflected via the bond market, and it's all going to come crashing down. And just as in 1976, if we have to go to the IMF, as soon as we have a loan, we'll no longer need it, because the conditions they will impose will be the ones that will restore market confidence. So, for God's sake, let us have that conversation before we get to that point. And what is essentially what we have to do, and this is an easy thing to say, I recognise, much harder to do, is we need a 5% reduction in the amount of public expenditure we send to health and social security. Now, that's not a massive reduction, but of course it'll be extraordinarily difficult, and frankly, I think it's a political non-starter.
David?
We should spare just a moment to think about the problems in a social media dominated world of actually having truthful conversations with each other or government with the public. It's much harder than it would have been 20 years ago to have that conversation. It ought to be about national priorities, national opportunities and national threats, the threats to the nation. Jolly hard to see how you construct such a conversation. I mean, it has to be done. I agree entirely with John. But let's just spare a thought for how you go about doing that in a world in which, if you're in the political arena these days, the slightest off message, the slightest contrary, you're hammered into the ground.
Thank you very much. Now, I've seen 3 hands go up, so I'm going to take 3 questions. If I asked, so they could be sort of quick questions. We'll put to the panel, and I will wrap us up by the time we said we would be wrapped up. So they are the 4 down the back, except for the gentleman in the brown suit. So if we start at the back with the light blue tie.
Freddie Tiedemolo from RAND Europe. This has been brought up a couple of times in this conversation, but we actually produced a report which is public for the MOD on how the the European nuclear deterrent is perceived by Russia. This was based on data up to about 2024, and the perception, perhaps inevitably, was that the British deterrent is somewhat sort of tied closely to the US deterrent, whereas the French deterrent is more national and independent. Some of that is obviously, and somewhat more friendly towards Russia. In the meantime, obviously, some of that rhetoric has changed, particularly from France. Maybe I can kind of guess what your response will be, but do you not think that there is some value to a European deterrent that is, if not, while strategically aligned with the US and obviously with NATO goals, can be strategically independent when necessary, when, for example, the US is politically unreliable?
Thank you. Woman down here. And then
Hi, I'm Sonia Amadei I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University. And my question is about the scenarios under which the B-6212 gravity bombs would be used, given that we need the capability as well as the credibility. So just what the thoughts are, since they would be from 0.03 kilotons to as much as 400 kilotons, when would they be used in the scenarios that would be planned?
thank you. And the gentleman in front, Ian.
So Ian Andrews, one of the vice chairs of the National Preparedness Commission. Just to point, Jock, on the national debate, successive governments have called for a national debate involving the whole of society of both complexions. The Prime Minister, in his speech to the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, actually talked about the Russian threat, talked about the threat to the whole of society, and said we have to level with the public to create the conditions in which those difficult decisions can be taken between the choices that need to be made. I have not seen any evidence of that being acted on.
Right, so value of a European deterrent, maybe discussion about who would own it, who the decision maker would be there. Conops Conem behind the B61, very interesting, I think, with Michael Quinlan's thoughts on that. And then finally the national debate, whither once you repatriate from Munich.
Well, if we're talking about a European deterrent controlled by Europe, whatever that is, I don't know. I don't think anybody does. There's a move within the EU at the moment to buy Europe, buy European. Some people in the EU think that means Europe, and some people think it means the EU. So no, I think it's meaningless to talk about a European thing, particularly when it comes to nuclear weapons. I mean, nuclear weapons are owned by nations, and frankly, given the difficulties associated with such weapons, it's going to have to continue to be so. And until Europe becomes a state, then that will always be the case. But as I said earlier, I do think there's a case for Europe being less reliant upon a single source supplier, as it were. And that was behind Michael Quinlan's point about being the second centre of decision. And that remains the case for us with our strategic deterrent, which is operationally independent. And I think that in future, it should be the case also with sub-strategic. And we talked about this earlier. It will not be using American weapons, but we need to think about where we go in the longer term, what we do perhaps with the French and perhaps with others in terms of future developments. So I think that there is, it depends whether I understood the question correctly, but I think that there is a scope for Europe in terms of individual nations to do more separately from the United States. Do you want to comment on that before we go to the answer?
Just a thought. It all depends on the language that we use to describe what you were saying. If we're talking about European nations bolstering their defences, building up their armed forces, being resolute in their approach, well, that's good. That's part of deterrence, however you define deterrence. But if we're talking about a conscious decoupling, where we're saying to ourselves, European nations, we can now, as it were, have not only conventional forces, we have European nuclear forces, accepting Jock's point about whose finger is on the trigger. That is actually achieving something that we spent years and years and years trying to avoid, which is the decoupling in the mind of the adversary of the United States power from the Europeans. That actually you can then imagine aggression taking place in Europe on the mistaken assumption that, well, the Americans will just stand aside. So I don't think we bring that on. So there is a way of constructing the argument that is actually strengthening deterrence. But there's also a way of constructing it that actually does the opposite. The mention of Munich, that the Prime Minister could give such an excellent speech at Munich, but doesn't feel that he can give it here, says quite a lot about where we are.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree. I would have made exactly the same point. Yeah, he made it in Munich, not in London or Birmingham or wherever.
But it wasn't reported. It wasn't reported.
Well, not very widely. No. On the B-61, I mean, I've got no idea what the concept of operations will be. I mean, I would just say that and one of the points we make in the paper is it's wrong to think in terms of tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons. I mean, they're all nuclear weapons. The tactical or strategic is really the context. And in any event, it's misleading. They're misleading terms because if you say a tactical use, people sort of think in their minds, about using it in the context of some wide battle to gain a tactical advantage to further the battle. I mean, that's not what it's there for. It's there to help fill a gap in the spectrum of capabilities, to make your overall response and the path. What's the engagement? Is that a relation to a green gauge? I'm not quite sure. More credible. So I think that it's important to remember that. But precisely what the Americans intend to do with it, of course, I have no idea. And so back to Ian's point. No, we see no evidence of it either. But what is interesting is that the conversation is emerging across the country, from the commentariat and also, and not just, as I said earlier, from the usual sources. That is a source of encouragement, but I think that's how we have to take it forward. As I said in answer to a previous question, I'm afraid that we can rely upon political leadership to do this for us.
Could I just offer both of you gentlemen a chance for one final message that you'd like the audience to take away tonight? If there was one thing you'd sum up your thoughts as they walk out the door, what should they take down in the lifts?
Don't think of this serious debate in terms of reinventing nuclear doctrine. Think about reinvigorating our thinking about relearning what we ought to never have forgotten. And that way, I think you come out in a reasonably sensible place.
Thank you. Lord Stirrup.
I would go back to the point I just made, which is if we can't rely upon our political leadership, we've got to rely upon ourselves. So evangelize.
I took the liberty of putting both our reports that I introduced at the start into ChatGPT and asked to find the dissonance, the incoherence between them, thinking someone, and it came back and, to your point, David, said actually the one looking at the third nuclear age and how we should adapt had followed on exactly the same principles as Michael Quinlan. So I think we can satisfy you on that. I won't sum up the whole thing. Very interesting. I think some very clear messages have come out tonight. The first is, in one way or another, we need to rebuild our Kremlinologists, and with a few that speak Mandarin too, we need to rebuild that through things like our professional military education, but difficult as it will be with churn and everything else across Whitehall. We do need European structures, and we need them in the conventional realm to support the whole of deterrence as well as in the nuclear realm, but we must build them in such a way that they don't become a wedge in NATO, and they are therefore complementary to the alliance that's kept us safe for many years. I think there were echoes there, if you like, of Bevin 45. The way to get the Americans' respect was to build our own bloody bomb and put the Union Jack on top of it. All that said, the treaties need to be rebuilt, and we must start the painful work of setting up the mature governance structure that can fold in the new nuclear powers, wherever they might be, the suggestion being that it's almost going to be unavoidable that other nations will now seek to get nuclear weapons, and therefore we must put a structure around that. But against that, perhaps a slightly more optimistic view, even if it is what looks to us like a strange and unfathomable theocratic regime, it cares about something, and therefore all can be deterred. But we're back to my opening comment. You have to understand, and we're back to the Kremlinologists, it's cognitive warfare, and deterrence is something we really have to think very deeply about. And I had put here, I want to thank them for starting the conversation. So I'm just going to finish by echoing Lord Stirrup's final point. We need to have this conversation. I thank you all for coming tonight to kick this off, but I really want to thank the two panellists who've proven me right. We couldn't have had two better panellists to discuss that tonight. Thank you very much, Lord Stirrup, Sir David Omand.